afternoon. My name is Brenna Anderst, and I am the Director of Education and Advocacy here at Pasado Safe Haven. Before I introduce you to our esteemed speaker, I wanted to let you all know that this event is being recorded so that we can share what we learn with those who are not able to attend today. No attendee information or identifiers will be shared in the recording. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Pasado Safe Haven's new speaker series. In this series, we will be featuring inspiring change makers and thought leaders whose diverse insights inspire us humans to reimagine our relationship with animals. I can't think of a better speaker to help us launch this new series than Dr. Aysha Akhtar. Dr. Akhtar is doing groundbreaking work, and we are absolutely thrilled that she is here with us today. Dr. Akhtar is a double board certified neurologist, preventative medicine and public health specialist, and published author, as well as the president and CEO of the Center for Contemporary Sciences, working on replacing animal testing with effective human-specific research techniques. She is also a U.S. veteran, previously serving as Deputy Director of the U.S. Army Traumatic Brain Injury Program and as a commander in the U.S. Public Health Commission Corps, assisting with national public health emergencies. For a decade, Dr. Akhtar was also a medical officer with the Food and Drug Administration, developing national preparedness strategies for public health threats. Dr. Akhtar is passionate about demonstrating how there is mutual benefit to both humans and animals when animals are protected. And I personally got connected with her in 2019 at the Animal Rights National Conference, where she was a featured speaker. After listening to her presentation, I ended up purchasing her book titled Our Symphony with Animals on Health, Empathy, and Our Shared Destinies. And this book I highly recommend to anybody watching today. She is also the author of another book titled Animals and Public Health, and is published in peer-reviewed journals including Lancet, Pediatrics, Journal of Public Health Policy, and reviews in the neurosciences. Before Dr. Akhtar shares with us today, I would like to remind everybody watching that we have a Q&A feature. And during her presentation, anybody is welcome to ask her a question using this Q&A feature. And we will review these questions at the end of her presentation as time allows. And with that, I am going to let Dr. Akhtar take it away from here.
Thanks so much, Brenna, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Let me go ahead and try to share my screen. And Brenna, I'm going to ask you to confirm that it looks like the proper sharing, that it's okay, good.
Yes, yeah,
okay,
looks
great.
Good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so what I'm basically going to be doing is giving you kind of a very brief overview, and by brief I mean really I could talk on and on for hours about how our health intersects with that of animals. So just think back, so just let your mind wander for a moment and think back to the year 1987. And my family and I were sitting around the dinner table and we were discussing different topics, and actually, somehow the topic got on to, should we be eating animals? And, you know, we were not vegetarians and we ate animals. And I don't know how the conversation got up, but when we talked about it, we decided together that, oh, well, eating animals seems like a natural and right thing to do. And it seems, you know, the natural order of things. So we just kept on eating animals. And the truth is that we didn't know anything about the topic, and we really didn't want to know anything about the topic. I mean, we were living in such ignorant bliss. Now you're going to have to excuse us because this, you have to realize that we were in so much bliss that we thought this was actually a good look. And this is my brother, my two sisters. I'm the brooding tomboy looking one in the center. And you can see my brother's lovely mustache and hair, and we actually thought that was a good look back then. So I think we can be excused for not being so bright and some other things. But fortunately, I grew up, and so did my sisters. I mean, I became a responsible adult. Look at me. I'm at my sister's wedding. I've got a glass of wine in one hand and a cup of water in another. Um, but I became really familiar with our interactions with animals and how that affects us, not only personally, but also on a professional level. But as a species, we're still very much in our adolescence. We continue to move on this planet with an adolescent worldview, in a sense. We are very focused on ourselves. We think we are just immortal, in a sense, right? And we don't really think beyond ourselves. And we have seen how that has actually come to affect us. We've seen that with this very pandemic. And so what I have learned as I started to learn more, both as a neurologist, as a public health specialist, and even in my personal experiences, is that in almost every way you can think, if not every way that you can think of, how we treat other animals, how we interact with other animals, our relationships with animals has an impact on us as well. And it could have an impact on us directly or indirectly. And as simplistic as this may sound, what I've learned really is when we save animals, we save ourselves. And of course, the flip side of that is when we hurt animals, we hurt ourselves too. So 2014, I don't know if you guys recall when Ebola raged across Western Africa. And Ebola continues to pop up in various parts of Africa from time to time and cause tremendous suffering and death. And so that virus is still out there, that virus is still mutating. Now, normally we routinely catch Ebola when we hunt, butcher, and kill animals from the African bush. And so we're talking about animals like non-human primates, pigs, types of monkeys, other types of animals that live in that area. And although this practice, actually the bushmeat, this is part of what's called the bushmeat trade, although this practice has existed for a long, long time, it wasn't until recent years, and I would say past couple of decades, that our risk for Ebola has really been ramped up. So now as we are clear cutting the forests, the jungles for the logging industry, and to create grazing for cattle and for farming, for animal farming, we are actually bringing animals and humans closer together than that's ever occurred before in these areas. So we are bringing these wild animals, which may at one point may have not had a lot of interaction with the human population at one time. Now they're having much more frequent interaction. And what that can do is cause spillover. That can lead to a spillover of a virus from one species onto another and onto human beings. So that's how actually we got HIV. Before 1981, no one had ever heard of HIV, but we suspected that the first case in a human occurred as a result of the bushmeat trade. Now, the bushmeat trade, though, is just one small part of a much larger wildlife trade in which we capture animals from the wild, or we breed them in captivity, or they're used to provide breeding stock for captive populations. And we might kill them in place, or we ship them around the globe. And these animals can be shipped around the globe for use as exotic fur, for their leather, for their skins, for use as meat, for use as medicinal objects, perfumes, for laboratory experiments, you name it. And as you can imagine, these animals suffer tremendously in the wildlife trade. They can be crammed, as you see in this picture, into cages. This doesn't even come close to really showing how bad it could be. Animals will suffocate and crush at the bottom of cages because they can be piled so high. And so what happens in the bushmeat trade is that it brings together a lot of very sick and very distressed animals. So it becomes kind of, in a sense, an ideal breeding grounds for a pathogen to pass from one animal to another and ultimately onto humans. So this is how we got SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. This happened in 2003. Now, SARS is a coronavirus. It's a cousin of COVID-19. So what happened in 2000 and I'm sorry, if I said 2019, I meant 2013. Here's what happened, and this is what we suspect happened. We suspect that the bushmeat trade that the SARS virus originated from a wild, or what's often called a wet or live market from China. Sounds familiar. That's how we think the current COVID-19 originated as well. And in a very short period of time, the virus circulated among Southeast Asia, and it killed about 1,000 people. And it had an incredibly high death rate, much higher than what we're experiencing with COVID-19. When public health authorities tried to track down the origin of of SARS, they found it circulating in these little guys. These are civets. They're often called civet cats. And they are often exploited and captured for the wildlife trade to be used for their musk-producing glands. So they're often used for perfumes. They're also, I think, if I understand correctly, their feces has something to do with coffee production as well. Now, when the Chinese public health authorities found the SARS virus in these little guys, their response was to kill thousands of them in these live markets. And they killed them in horrendously horrible ways. They killed them by electrocuting them, by drowning them in disinfectants, and by other terrible means, as you can imagine. Then what happened was that we started to look further, and we started to suspect that the coronavirus, SARS coronavirus, which is the acronym for severe acute respiratory syndrome, that it didn't originate in civet cats, but it originated in these guys. And these are fruit bats. And they are also exploited for the wildlife trade. And what we know today is that fruit bats can actually be carriers of a wide range of different viruses. And in the fruit bats, the viruses doesn't usually cause illness. They're just carriers. But what happens in the wildlife trade is that, and what we suspect happened with the origination of SARS, is that at some point in the wildlife trade, fruit bats came into contact with another species or directly into contact with civets. And the coronavirus passed from fruit bats onto civets, maybe onto another species, and ultimately onto humans. Now, I know that sounds like a very, very similar case of what's happening now. And we do know that this is pretty much, we suspect at least, this is how we got COVID-19. Now, what's really frustrating is that we saw this back in, I think I said 2013, and I apologize, this was 2003 when SARS emerged. 2003, and we knew what the wildlife trade can do and how it can lead to these, the emergence of new infectious diseases. What the problem is that when people think about the origin of these viruses, like currently the coronavirus that we're experiencing today, people tend to look at these live markets in China and just pinpoint to that. But the problem is that the live market is really just one endpoint of a much, much larger wildlife trade, a global wildlife trade, in which we in the US are very much a culprit and very much involved in this. As a matter of fact, the US is one of the largest exporters and importers of wildlife. And so, again, as you know, in the wildlife trade, what we're doing is we're bringing sick, distressed animals. And what that does is that decreases their immune system, that lowers their immune system, and that makes it harder for them to fight off infections. And then you're bringing many different species together, species which may normally not interact with each other, right? Species from different parts of the world. And so then one species may be exposed to an entire novel virus that it's never encountered before. And because of their already lowered immune system from the distress, and then this new virus that they're exposed to, it's very easy for a virus to jump from animal to animal and ultimately to human. So because of the wildlife trade, no one anywhere is safe from deadly infectious diseases. And we now know that about 3/4 of emerging infectious diseases tend to come from other animals. but it's not the animal's fault. It's how we treat animals, it's how we relate with them, it's our relationships with animals that's causing this rise in infectious diseases. So this pandemic that we're experiencing today could have been prevented. And it should be a reminder to everyone that how we treat animals truly does come back to affect us. And nowhere actually does that link shows more strongly than in how we eat. And that strong link really comes out when we think about animals in factory farms. I know probably many of you have seen many pictures of animals in factory farms. I visited some when I was, a few years ago for my book, Our Symphony with Animals. I visited some over in, I'm blanking on the state, Oklahoma. And I have to tell you, I've seen pictures, I've seen videos of factory farms, but they don't even come close to what these places really like, because here you're experiencing these places with all your senses. I mean, the first thing you notice is the deafening roar of all these animals crammed. Thousands of animals, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of animals crammed into a single building. And it is so loud, it actually can hurt your ears. The next thing you may notice, and which I did, is the incredible stench. I mean, when I walked into some of these farms, I wanted to gag. The stench was so bad. And then, of course, you can smell that ammonia. You can smell that the feces. You can see the filth that's circulating in these places. And these animals are experiencing these throughout their entire lives. Even though their lives are short, even for this, their lives are fully taking place in these kinds of miserable situations. So as with the wildlife trade, what happens in factory farms is you're cramming a lot of species together into tight places. They're enduring incredible suffering, and they're miserable, and they're distressed, and again, their immune systems are down. So the crowding and the lowered immune system, again, makes it very easy for a virus to pass from one animal to another in a factory farm and spread like wildfire. Now, in the 90s, H5N1 emerged, and that was a highly pathogenic avian influenza. It's a bird flu. It's a type of bird flu. When that emerged, that also emerged in China. At least that's what we expect. And unlike the virus that we're experiencing today, the coronavirus, this particular virus was so deadly, it killed about 60% of the people who contracted the virus. 60% of the people who got this type of bird flu ended up dying from it. In contrast, the coronavirus that we're experiencing today is killing about 2 to 3% of people who get it. So as bad as the pandemic is today, as bad as this virus is that we're experiencing now, it's not nearly as bad as it can be. Now, I know when I talk about an influenza virus, when we talk about bird flus and things like that, they tend not to get people's anxiety up. You know, you think about influenza viruses and you think, oh, that's the seasonal flu, I get a vaccine for it, no big deal. That's not really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the kinds of influenza viruses that are circulating in factory farms. These influenza viruses are called influenza A viruses. And because they can be carried by a wide variety of species, in addition to humans, they are very difficult to track and contain. And they can easily evade any kind of surveillance that we may have to track the viruses that may emerge and may cause a pandemic. And what's worse is that not only are we seeing multiple cases of bird flu sweeping across factory farms again and again, and you guys have probably read and seen the media reports, how many times they've had to cull chickens and birds, other types of birds in factory farms, not only here in the US, but also elsewhere, in China, in Mexico, in England, this just happened to me recently, in Europe, because these bird flu sweep across these farms. Now, if that's not bad enough, pigs are actually what we call virus mixing vessels. So in pigs, an influenza virus, so pigs can carry influenza viruses not only from other pigs, but also from other humans and other birds. So basically, in a pig, because they can carry viruses from two other species, it makes it very easy for a new virus that can emerge that can have the combination to be both deadly and contagious. Now, despite how deadly that H5N1 virus was that I mentioned earlier, that kills 60% of people who got infected, we were very lucky because it ended up not being very contagious. So to really have a pandemic, you need to have both something that is very contagious and something that can cause a high impact in the human population, can be deadly, can have a high illness rate, and so on. With the bird flus that have been coming out, or the other types of influenza viruses that have been coming out from these factory farms, we haven't seen that combination just yet. But I guarantee it's only a matter of time before a new virus does come out that has that combination. And you see, because these animals, these viruses and animals on factory farms are kind of like nightclubs for different viruses. In these poor animals in these factory farms, different influenza viruses can get together, they can exchange greetings and then swap genetic material. And each time that happens, a virus can acquire a mutation that not only makes it easy to be transmittable among humans, but it could be something that we've never seen before. And it could be something that is very deadly for us. So what I'm trying to say is that as bad as the pandemic is today, and as horrible as it has been for so many of us, and it's caused such a tremendous amount of human suffering, the problem is that unless we honestly get back to fundamentally changing how we relate with animals, we are unfortunately going to see more and more pandemics emerge. And we're probably going to see a far, far worse one than what we're experiencing today. And so what I really do propose is that this is the time, if there's no other time in human history to really evaluate how we relate with animals, I don't know what is. This really is the time for us to take a hard look at how we look at all animals, not just our cats and dogs, not just chimpanzees or the elephants, or what some people call the sexy animals, or the popular animals, but to also look at the animals that we largely overlook in our society: the pigs, the chickens, the turkeys, the animals that are involved in the wildlife trade that never get much attention at all. All of these animals, we have to really take a fundamental look at how we treat them. So in a very simplistic way, what I would suggest is that we need to stop seeing animals as what, and instead, we need to start seeing them as who. So I'll just end there. I didn't want to go into too long of a discussion because I know many people may have questions, and so I'd love to open this up. So I'm going to stop sharing the slide, and now I'm going to open this up for any kind of questions that you may want to throw at me.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing with us. That was really, really interesting and really thought-provoking as well. I do have a question that actually came through our Instagram account. So I'm just going to start off with that one. And that is, what role does the widespread use of antibiotics play in factory farms when we think about the potential spread of disease to humans?
Mm-hmm. So we do know that about 70% of the world's antibiotics are being pumped into animals in factory farms. And many of them, if not most of them, have human relevance, meaning that they're antibiotics that have some relevance to antibiotics that we may be using in humans or we may need in humans, and that they are a significant contributor to the rise in antibiotic resistance that we're seeing. But what most people don't seem to understand, or what many people seem to confuse, is that antibiotics don't combat viruses, they're against bacteria. So when we're talking about pandemics, we're really talking about viruses, because viruses can really spread easily among humans. I mean, and we're really talking about especially viruses that can get airborne. And we don't see that really with bacteria. So that's why when we're talking about pandemics, we talk about viruses. But what happens? But antibiotics do play a role in pandemics, or can potentially play a role in pandemics, because what happens often is during a pandemic, people get hit with a virus and they may not actually die from the virus itself. What happens is that their immune systems take a hit from the virus, and it makes them much more vulnerable to get what's called superimposed bacterial infections. And this is what actually was driving the high death rate for many people for a long time, for those who had HIV. Many people weren't dying from the actual infection from the HIV, but from the superimposed bacterial infections that followed. So to combat those bacterial infections that may follow, we really need as many useful antibiotics as we can get.
Yeah, and going off of that, of course, factory farms are the ones that are predominantly using these antibiotics. And can you speak a little bit about why they're using, as you said, 75% of the world's antibiotics on these large-scale farms?
Yeah, it's about 70%, and that's just an estimate. I've known there's so little transparency in this thing, but it really is, because you saw some photos of some of the conditions, and they're really not exaggeration. I mean, these conditions exist in factory farms. And at some point, it was in around 1970s, what researchers found is that by feeding animals low continuous doses of antibiotics, they could be used as what's called growth promoters. It helped animals survive in these conditions, and it helped their growth. And I would say, in a sense, you can't have factory farms without antibiotics or other type of similar medications being used in animals, because, again, I don't think they would survive long enough for these agribusinesses to make a profit unless they're pumping either antibiotics or some other type of drug into these animals again and again. So that's how they stemmed. That's how the use of antibiotics stemmed, and that's why they're continuing today.
Okay, well, another question that we have is, based on your extensive research and work on the connections between public health and animals, what do you believe is the best way to prevent a future pandemic?
So I will say one of the single biggest things everyone can do is stop eating animals, and if they're not willing to at least stop eating animals, to at least significantly cut back on eating animals. It really is. I mean, I know it sounds so simplistic, but we're not, first of all, our planet cannot sustain, factory farming and animal agriculture at the level that it's currently happening. We just cannot sustain it. It's killing our planet in a sense. And factory farming, because of all the clearing of land to produce feed crops to these animals, that's also bringing us closer, human populations closer to the wildlife. So that's increasing that risk of spillover that I talked about earlier in the presentation. So it's taking away animals' natural habitat. Of course, and then we have this direct risk of influenza viruses and maybe some other viruses coming out of factory farms. I'll tell you, there was a study that showed, Ebola, as horrible as it is, and I know it's very scary. A lot of people are very scared of Ebola, but we've been lucky because Ebola is really something that's transmitted, at least so far, through bodily fluids. So you get it if you're, really exposed to bodily fluids like blood, semen, urine, feces, saliva, and so on that may carry Ebola virus. So it's not airborne. Now, if Ebola ever became airborne, then we're really in a lot of trouble. A few years ago, I think it was about maybe 10 years ago, researchers actually found an Ebola virus circulating in pigs in Indonesia that actually had a way to recognize receptors not only in the noses of the pigs, but actually in human noses. And what that means is that this was a virus that could potentially become airborne. And that's really scary. And that Ebola virus, I don't know what's happened to it. It's still out there. These viruses don't go away. They're still out there. That Ebola virus is still out there. So that is a virus that could become airborne one day because of factory farming. So it's not just the influenzas that we may have to worry about from factory farms. There's other types of viruses as well.
Another question that just came in, and this is a stem off of what we were just talking about, but of course, recently that new documentary came out, Seaspiracy, and one of our attendees was asking if you could talk a little bit more about the risks of fish farming and eating fish.
So I don't know. So as far as infectious diseases are concerned, I don't think there's a high risk for us in that respect as far as eating fish and the fishing industry. And it's because we're so different from fish in so many ways that we don't really, what infects them, what causes illnesses in them, virus, when it comes to bacterial infections and viruses, doesn't really translate so well to causing the same problems with us. We are more likely, but that's what we know today. Maybe that will change one day. I don't know. The more different an animal is from us in basic physiology, the less likely we are to catch a virus from that animal. So it's much more likely for us to catch a virus from other warm-blooded animals, from mammals. And then when you go further out from, reptiles, and we do know we can get bacterial infections from turtles and frogs, salmonella, for example. But I don't know of any real infectious disease threat that comes from eating fish.
Another question that I was wondering about, this is more about COVID-19 and potential mutations. We've seen mutations coming out of places like mink farms. Is there further threat of future mutations of COVID-19 or other viruses coming out of large factory farms, mink farms, fur farms?
Yeah, right. So mink farms are just like other factory farms. And I mean, my God, it's so frustrating because it's like people wake up. We're seeing this again and again, how these factory farms are contributing either to a new virus or a revamping of a virus, right? A new variant of something. And there was just such a lackluster response to what's happening in these big mink farms, right? And so unfortunately, there's been no real ban on mink farming that I'm aware of. There were temporary curtailing of some of these mink farms, but they're still out there. They're still continuing. So the coronavirus can still be out there circulating among these mink farms. There have been some reports of spillover from mink in farms to mink out in the wild. And so the virus could then be circulating among mink out in the wild, and maybe that will come back to us as well. Or at the very least, it may cause a lot of harm to the wild populations of mink, in addition to the animals in the mink farms. So it's as long as we are providing these kinds of conditions, we are providing pretty much a natural laboratory for mutations to occur and for new viruses to occur. Now, one way to think of it is, you think about it, right? So when the pandemic started, and it's only just recently things have changed, but we've been told, and rightly so, by our public health agencies, that we need to socially distance, right? That's how we limit the spread of viruses. But we have done the exact opposite when it comes to animals. We don't socially distance them, we cram them. We've been told to keep our immune system, stay healthy, exercise, These are all things that will help us fight off infections. And again, we're doing the exact opposite with animals in these factory farms, in mink farms. And so we have just not taken the lessons that apply to us and applying them to other species.
So another question that just came in, which I think is a really great one, is what would the alternatives be for the livelihood of factory farmers? So how could we transition that industry to be more socially distanced or more compassionate towards these animals that they keep in these terrible conditions?
So to be honest, I don't think, I'll be honest. I think, gosh, there's no middle ground here. You know, if there's too many people on this planet, we cannot continue to produce the same amount of meat, eggs, and dairy for the appetite that exists without factory farms. And it's not to the economic advantage of agribusiness to socially distance these animals to provide more space. They actually see culling animals when a new bird flu sweeps across, you know, a new factory farm or region in the world as kind of part of practice now. It's just routine part of practice that is taken into account, I think, in part of their economic analyses. So there's no incentive for them to really socially distance animals. So if we really want to minimize the risk, we've got to pretty much stop factory farming. And that really then comes down to let's not eat animals altogether, or really cut down on eating animals. And I'm sorry, Brent, I know there was another part to the question I wanted to directly answer. Could you repeat that question again?
Yeah, let me just pull it up one more time to make sure I got it all. It was mostly how can we find alternatives for the livelihood of these factory farmers?
There you go. Yeah, that's so there have actually been some effort to do that by several organizations already. And so some of these farmers are actually switching over into more, which are definitely more sustainable, environmentally friendly agriculture, plant agriculture. Some of them are being used to produce like pea protein and other types of plant protein that are being used more and more in these plant-based products that we're seeing coming out more and more. And so I think just like with everything, I mean, you know, you think about the horse-drawn carriages, and then, you know, that switched over to cars and so on. I think with every time we talk about the loss of some jobs, there's opportunity for retraining. I don't know what the exact word is, that there's a word, a terminology that's used for, cannot think of it, when you're training people to follow a different job, in a sense, to make it easier for them to switch over to a different type of job. But there are many opportunities, and that can be part of our governmental subsidies program. Our government, and we, through our taxes, are really highly subsidizing agribusiness, animal agribusiness. It's ridiculous how much of our money is going to subsidizing animal agribusinesses. So if we were to switch to a predominantly plant-based way of growing food that was being used to directly feed us, as opposed to going into animals and then coming to us in a very inefficient rate, we could use a lot of that money, that subsidies money, to actually retrain people to either go into plant agriculture or some other line of business. I know there are efforts that are happening now, but I think there's a role for a real governmental effort in that as well.
Yeah, and I mean, this is just me speaking as someone whose livelihood isn't based off of agriculture, but I would imagine that eventually it would actually be cost effective for these farmers, because of course it's more cost effective and land effective to grow plants versus grow plants to then feed animals that they are producing for the public. A question that just came in regards to this is, if we increase vegetarianism or veganism, won't we still need to clear land for growing? And while this will address infections, it causes an environmental issue.
So what actually, no, actually, we are actually going to be saving more land by not eating animals. Actually, animal agriculture is the number one human use of our land out of every other type of industry practice. We use more land for animal agriculture than for any other purpose. I think there was a statistic that was like almost like 30% of the arable land is being used for animal agriculture. And so for single purposes, this animal agriculture is the single highest use of land. What happens is that it takes about 10 pounds of, let's say, plant protein or plant product to produce 1 pound of animal protein. So in order to feed these animals, we're actually clearing a lot more land to feed them, to ultimately feed us, because there's a very inefficient conversion rate there. we could actually feed a lot more people, arguably everyone on this planet, if we actually and cut down on our land use if we actually had people eat directly plant products as opposed to eating animal products. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and honestly, that could be a whole new speaker series right there, talking
Yeah.
about the environmental implications of factory farming and our use of animals and all of that. It really is that's a great question that somebody brought up, because it just shows another link. And I think you talked about in your presentation, the more of this land that we're using, the closer we're getting to these wild animals whose habitats we're taking away by this land use. So again, it really shows just how interconnected all of these issues are.
Yeah, and if I can just also add, Amazon, the clearing of the Amazon, the #1 cause is for animal agriculture. It's for cattle grazing, to create land for cattle grazing there, and for feed crops that go to feed animals. So again, we're so much better off in so many ways. Environmentally, we can reduce the pollutions, the chemicals, the fertilizers, the pesticides, everything that we are doing to our planet. If we just make one fundamental change, which really comes down to choosing one plate of food over another.
A question that just came in from, it says, as a college student interested in both medical school and animal rights, I've noticed that these two topics are often kept separate. How do you recommend that physicians work to incorporate animal health into their field? I think this is a great question for you. This is basically your specialty, so.
Yeah, that was a frustration for me, is that when we ever talked about our relationships with animals, it was mostly just our cats and dogs, which is nice. Everyone loves their dogs, so that's an easy topic. Or we talked about potentially the risk of infectious diseases from animals. We never talked about deeper, then we never went deeper into that. We just, talked about, oh, you could get rabies or this and this and this from other animals. That was pretty much it. And I think that that's still pretty much it, not only in medical schools, but in public health schools. So I kind of, if any of you ever watch X-Files, if you know about the title, The Lone Gunman, and of course that goes back to the Kennedy shooting as well, I kind of saw myself, I was a bit of a lone gunman here, in that I tried to start creating basically my own path. And that was really to showcase, look, there's so many intersections between human health and animal well-being and how we treat animals, and we need to start waking up and start really addressing this. So I wish I could say that I have an answer for you. I think the pandemic is one good way to start. Obviously, if there's no other clear-cut connection between how we treat animals and how that impacts us, as this pandemic is currently showing, I don't know what else there is. So, this is a great jumping point. So if you're going into medical school, thank you. We need people like you to go into it. I suspect that you will somehow be able to find a way to at least start bringing these issues in. And you can work with your curriculum, folks with your medical school, for example, to develop curriculum. And that really looks into these issues in more depth. And you can have student symposiums to bring people like me and other people to come talk to students directly if your school isn't going to invite this. So you can do that through your own ways as well.
Yeah, and throughout the course of your career, have you seen shifts? Have you seen like a change in the way this interconnection is presented or approached?
So to some degree, yes, but not nearly enough. What's a catchphrase that's being used now is called the One Health approach. And this actually came from the veterinary world. And it's basically saying, oh, what diseases that affect animals can affect humans as well. And so human health is connected with animal health. What a lot of people don't realize is that it's not really, when we talk, it's not really a fundamental look at how we treat animals. It's more like, let's have more veterinarians in factory farms, so that we can monitor these animals for potential infectious diseases that may impact humans. Or, we should, be a little bit more mindful about We have to have greater surveillance and things like that. That's pretty much how that discussion goes. So unfortunately, that's been, a lot of people think that this One Health approach is where we're supposed to be going, but it's not. It's really, it doesn't change actually how we treat animals. It's just more like oh, we need to have better surveillance, and let's get veterinarians to help do this surveillance. And so I haven't seen any real change other than that, and that's not really much of a change.
Another question is coming from somebody that has done a lot of social justice work and has also been involved in the animal protection movement. And something that they've noticed is that a lot of times people are not moved by just plain old facts. So the question is, how do we change hearts and minds when the facts often cause people to shut down?
That's what I tried to do actually with my book, Our Symphony with Animals, because the first book, Animals in Public Health, was just dry. It was facts. It was academic. So then with the second book, I decided to switch and kind of appeal emotionally to people. So it's more narrative in a sense, or it brings people in a very softer way. And it was a book geared towards those who love their dogs and cats, but don't really think about how we relate with other animals. So it starts off kind of soft in a sense, and very light issues that most people can agree on. And then it slowly brings them into this journey into some of the harder issues, and to get to them to think about the animals in factory farms, the animals that we experiment on, and so on. And so that was, I don't know how successful that was, but that was the intention of that book. You're right. You're absolutely right. Actually, facts really don't change most people's mind. I mean, we like to think we're very logical beings, but we're very emotional beings. And studies have shown again and again that we make decisions based on our emotions, not not based on facts. So in this case, what I think may work is really appealing to people's, their experiences and the suffering. A lot of people have suffered during this pandemic, whether it's economically, they've lost their lives, or they've suffered serious long-term consequences of having been infected with the coronavirus, or they've lost family members because of this, or friends because of this. So I think that may be one way to bring people, is to say, okay, God, we went through so much. Do we want to go through this? I know if you know someone who personally has suffered, or knows someone who has suffered, maybe that's a way to bring them into this. And then talk about some of the similarities between, the infections that are happening in the wildlife markets in China, and the infections that are happening as a result of the larger wildlife trade and as a result of factory farming. And maybe that kind of a personal, emotional angle will appeal more to some people. The other thing I think is really good is that a lot of people, I know it's hard for them. They don't want to look at factory farm pictures. They don't want to look at these, They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to do anything about it. But at the very least, they don't even want to look at these photos. So you're not going to get to those people by trying to show them these photos. So the other thing you could try is really showing the positive images of chickens and pigs, and show who these animals really are. Show chickens in being just wonderful critters, and pigs being wonderful critters. And I think the more people get to know who these animals are in the best ways possible, that can help connect them with the larger issues as well.
Yeah, I love that you bring up that connection side of things, especially that storytelling aspect. I think us at Pasado Safe Haven, we're very fortunate that we are also an animal sanctuary. So we get to experience some of these stories and this brighter side of things that you were talking about, and help make people connect with animals in this more positive light versus just through facts or startling images and things like that.
Yeah.
One question that I've been saving that I think is a really good one is, what can we do to help and make a difference and just be a better advocate?
So one thing everyone can do is, whenever you see anything in the media about vaccines, about the coronavirus, about the pandemic, especially the ones that have those comment sections that you can post a comment, post comments. Please do. Tell the media and post them to again say, we are going to have another pandemic because we haven't learned from this one. Even if it's a question like that, and say, you know, media, you have done a terrible job at really diving deep into these issues. And, you know, people read these comments, people really do. And you can post 2 lines, I don't care. Take something from one of my blogs or something. I just copy exactly what you want, copy and paste it, or take it from someone else's, you know, copy and paste it, and just keep doing that. We need our media to pay more attention to the root cause of this pandemic and to the root cause of the next likely pandemic, which will be factory farms. So that's one thing you can do. Of course, you can write letters to the editors and so on. And then short of that, if you're not already vegan, I suggest you really think about going vegan. There's so many benefits. There's no downside to it whatsoever. You will benefit individually, health-wise. The planet will benefit. You know, our population will benefit when we think about infectious diseases, climate change, and everything else. And then, of course, the animals will benefit. So there's just nothing but plus sides to that. And then just try to help other people to eat fewer animals. And that's something you can do by hosting potlucks or whatever it is, to try to bring people into that way of thinking, and to, it's a pleasant way to bring people into the issue, right? Food, everyone loves food, and no one's going to say no to food. So you just bring them in through food, and then you can maybe start having these conversations with people.
I love that. Yes. Bring them in with food and they'll join. So going along with that, you know, a lot of people, they might have aspirations to be vegan or vegetarian, but maybe they're not quite there yet in their journey. Could you give some just like actionable steps for somebody that might just be starting out or just leaning into veganism?
Well, there's some great campaigns like Meatless Mondays. I think there was a Veganuary, so going vegan for the month of January. So, and these are, you can Google them and you'll see them. So these are great ways to get started on this. And, you know, if you want to think about cutting back, what I suggest is don't go to, you know, like quinoa. If you're not used to that kind of food, don't go to an extreme drastic thing. Cut back. Like, let's say you like mac and cheese. Who doesn't like mac and cheese? You know, maybe replace it with a vegan cheese, right? So it's still comfort food. It's still something that you're familiar with, but you're replacing it with something that's vegan, but still something that you know, in a sense, right? And then switch, you know, a Burger King burger, a regular, you know, Whopper with the Impossible Whopper. Make those kind of changes, and so make the changes. If you're switching from one product to another, switch from something that you're used to something that's just a little bit different, in a sense, because I think that can make it easier for you as well. I know when I first became vegan, I was looking at all kinds of ways of just recreating the same type of feel, the texture, what I grew up with, basically those kinds of foods. So, you know, do that. If that's going to help you to transition, then try that approach.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that approach. I think so many people get turned off by the idea that they might have to just live off of vegetables and salad, but that's completely untrue. There's so many amazing alternatives out there on the market, and new ones coming out every single day, which is amazing. So, Dr. Akhtar, I want to thank you so much for your time with us today. I hope everybody in our audience learned as much as I did. And to everyone that joined us today for our very first speaker series event, thank you so much. If you are interested in joining us for future events with our sanctuary, or if you want to join us in our mission of ending animal cruelty through volunteerism, donation, or adoptions, you can visit our website at pasadosafehaven.org. But again,